Well, hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. I am your host today, Kelly Ann. I am so ecstatic to be here with you today. We are going to dive into this really beautiful conversation where the intersection of faith and women's rights and abortion access meet. So we are so excited today to pick our guests' brain. And as a loving gesture of loving kindness towards you, dear listener, I want to give a little bit of a standard trigger warning. In this episode, we will be talking about sexual assault. We will be talking about rape. We will be talking about pregnancy loss and other related topics. So please take care of yourself. We love you. We know you love you. So if this episode isn't for you, that's totally fine. We have literally over 100 more that you could choose to listen to. So we wish you all the best as we dive into this conversation. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds
without expectation or judgment.
We will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
I'm so excited to be back in the studio with both of you. Listeners, as you know, I am always here with my beautiful friends, Kelly and Emma.
Hello.
Hello.
And like I said, I'm your host today, Kelly Ann, and we have the one and only Katey Zeh here with us today.
Whoop, whoop.
Welcome, Katey. Katey is a reverend and ordained Baptist minister, the author of the books A Complicated Choice and Women Rise Up. She's the CEO of the nonprofit Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Katey, we are so stoked to have you here with us today.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So as we just kind of warm up to this beautiful big conversation and kind of dive in, would you please tell us just a little bit about your background and the kind of work you do?
Well, I share a similar post-evangelical identity with all of you. I grew up in a small southern town in Georgia that even the Catholics were evangelical there. That was just the culture, and was doing deconstruction before I really even knew what that was, before that was really a term. That was part of my faith journey starting in college, really, when I started to study theology. And I realized, wow, people have been practicing Christianity in all different ways for so long that I'd never been told about before, which felt like an awakening, but also a bit of a betrayal of not having known all of that. And so that was really like a big turning point for me in my faith journey. I ended up going to Yale Divinity School because I was not tired of school at the end of college. And that was really when I felt this pull to do the work that I do now around reproductive freedom and dignity. When I was a student, I actually took some trainings with the organization I now run, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, because they were teaching students, how do you accompany someone who has a pregnancy and they're not sure what they're going to do about it and they're having a spiritual crisis? And that was not being taught in the classroom. And so I felt very compelled to take those classes because that felt like this is something real. This is what people actually deal with day in and day out. And once I was done with the trainings, I really felt like I wanted to use them in the real world, because I think so often we do trainings and then never use the skills. So I ended up volunteering at an abortion clinic just down the street and felt my own abortion stigma come up as I went into the clinic, and being seen, perceived as a patient and later as a staff person, and what people deal with day in, day out, going in, trying to get medical care of all kinds, and what the staff deal with. And then experienced this really sacred, holy work that was going on the inside of the clinic. And I just felt like, okay, I have to find a way to bridge these two things, because the people who share my faith identity are outside yelling and harassing patients and doctors. Yeah. And here I am, inside this clinic with mostly non-religious people, I would say, doing the work, but who are doing the holy, sacred work. And so for me, that really felt like the call to ministry that I now live into, which is advocating for reproductive freedom and dignity because of my faith and not in spite of it.
I love that you identified that work as sacred and holy. Like, that gave me goosebumps. And I think it's so often that the church, or at least my experience of the church, passes over that really beautiful sacred work, that like getting in the mud, if you will, in the midst of a really hard time in someone's life, where they're, like your book is titled, they're making a really complicated choice. So that's really beautiful. Thank you for naming it.
I think in general, the church sanitizes our reproductive lives in their fullness, not just a time when someone needs to terminate a pregnancy, but miscarriage or infertility, or just making the decision whether or not to create a family of your own and how you do that. I feel like all of that is just, it's just sanitized even in the story of Jesus's birth. Like, we don't really talk about the messiness and the potential danger that Mary was facing in those circumstances. So I always try to lift up the examples that we do have from the tradition where we really can relate it to what people are going through today. We have some of those stories in the sacred text. We just don't tend to focus on this aspect of what is so human and common to all of us. Like, someone birthed all of us into the world. We all have a connection to this greater story. And I think it's such a missed opportunity when faith communities don't address it, because so many people are suffering silently with stories that they feel like they can't share or name. And it would be the thing that would tie so many people together if there was safety in sharing those stories and experiences.
Well, and what you're describing sounds so stark, like such a stark contrast to my experience pre-post evangelical life,
pre-deconstruction,
that where I volunteered at a pro-life clinic, that it just never felt right in my gut. We were like helping these women decide not to have abortions, basically, and then
you're like convincing them.
Yeah, and providing a pregnancy test, which at this point, even at that point, wasn't even helpful.
You can literally go to
get
the dollar
just
store.
as effective of a pregnancy test anywhere.
Yeah.
And so we were just sitting down with these women, completely unqualified, like trying to help. I didn't walk away from that experience feeling like it was a holy endeavor at all. It just felt kind of pointless and sort of coercive and under-equipped and et cetera, et cetera. But
I'm curious because, audience, we've been on a little bit of a hiatus actually for Kelly's maternity leave. And so now, like, coming to this conversation, a new mom, like, wow. What's that like? How has that shifted your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think this morning, actually, as I was reflecting, like in the shower before our podcast, I was just thinking about how costly life is. Like, to bring a life into the world is a very costly endeavor, I guess. And I liked what you were saying, Katey, about how that's so unrecognized in evangelical spaces, like miscarriage and all of these, and stillbirth, et cetera, all these stories that people experience, but really don't have like space to grieve or talk about it or be open about it. And there is it's a huge burden to bring a life into the world. And it should be costly, I think, because it's significant. We don't acknowledge, I think, the costliness of that on the pro-life side of the conversation or the anti-choice side of the conversation.
Yeah.
So anyways, I like that. I like what you bring up there.
Yeah. And Katey, I'm curious, like, it's really helpful to hear like the overarch of your story as you went from like, evangelical Georgia and the Bible Belt and like a very conservative environment when it comes to beliefs around faith and beliefs around reproductive rights. And I would love to hear like more of what piqued your interest towards reproductive rights. Like, you wound up in an abortion clinic, you were learning from the RCRC, the nonprofit that you now run, but like, how does one get to that from the conservative evangelicalism of Georgia, of all places?
I think it's so easy looking back to feel like it's this very streamlined experience, but I think there were lots of twists and turns along the way, because it was a journey. It took years to get there.
Yeah.
But I think for me, the first moment of the cracking of that evangelical structure was when I first read the very first essay that's considered feminist theology. And I had just never been introduced to the idea of what it meant to have a female experience within the church, and how all of our concepts, theological concepts, are very masculine. in terms of, and the point of this one was about sin was very defined. And I mean, there's lots of gender binary stuff in this, so just hang in there. But it basically was saying like men's sin and women's sin take different forms. And sin is defined as selfishness a lot of the times in the tradition, which I resonated with growing up evangelical. That was a lot of the sounding of sin was like you're only thinking of yourself and you're to disregard others. And the point of this essay was written by a woman named Valerie Saving, I think in the 1950s or 60s, was women often sin by not valuing themselves and by immersing themselves in the lives of others and not tending to their own dignity. And I just remember thinking, whoa, I mean, yes, that I'd never heard anything like that. And so I think it was just this process over time of being introduced to new ideas that resonated with me in ways that the evangelical teachings just never felt true. Like Kelly, when you were saying, it just never really felt right. I think there was part of me that never felt totally bought in to a lot of the teachings, but because there had not been an alternative presented to me, I didn't know what to do with that tension other than to just go along with it, at least in the optics. But once I saw that there were other ways of being and other ways of practicing and other ways of being faithful that were much more nuanced, like I was finding my place of how I could still stay within this much broader tradition, but actually live into what felt intuitively true to me. And so I think gender became, the kind of the first lens through which I started to deconstruct the tradition, because I had felt personally negated by it and marginalized and was told I couldn't do certain things because of my anatomy, and who I was somehow a problem in and of itself. So I think that naturally led me into thinking about like, what does motherhood mean? What does it mean to be embodied as a woman? And that naturally leads to a curiosity about sexuality and reproduction. And so I think for me, it was just exploring all the different ways that had shown up in my upbringing, especially around purity culture, which was so big when I was growing up.
Yeah.
It makes sense that I was looking for like, what's the flip side of this? What are other people of faith saying about this that's different from what I was exposed to? And I think reproduction just brings into the forefront so many things all at one time. It's relationship and love and sex and identity and purpose in the world and healthcare. I mean, it just, so many things come to the forefront in this intersectional way that I feel like anyone should be able to connect whatever they're passionate about to this issue, because it really does impact all of our lives. And I guess for me, it just felt like this nexus point of these are all the things that I care about coming together at once. And also just like ethical questions too about what does life mean? What does death mean? It just was a natural place for me to sort of land, because there's so many big questions in real life questions, circumstances that come together in this, decision point that's connected to so many other parts of your life at once. So that's the best that I can figure. And I think also at the time, seminary was very esoteric and heady and felt so disconnected from real people's lives. And I wasn't in seminary to just think. I really wanted to be someone active in the world. And so I think I was hungry and looking for a way to combine what I was learning with how I could show up for people. And this opportunity came to me. And I think it was very spirit-led, to be honest. I think it was where I was supposed to land, and the doors just opened for me at the right time when I was ready to receive that call. I'm sounding very Christian right now.
You are. You're like, the Spirit led me to this holy ministry.
I know. And that feels true.
Yeah.
That does feel true. Yeah.
That's great. I love it, and I think that might make quite a few evangelicals' heads spin around from the thought that is what your experience was. I hear the same thing when people who are gay talk about how God told them it was okay that they were gay, or they talk about how they have these spiritual experiences in which they feel very validated in their queerness by the Christian God. And that makes people so mad, and I love it. I love the Spirit-led, Spirit leading you to the abortion clinic and and also leading you to write your book all about like the the need for being pro-choice. And you mentioned in the feminist theology that you read that they said that really like one of the sins that women so often experience is invalidating themselves, and how that makes me think of the verse. I don't remember the reference of the verse, but the Bible verse that talks about like sins of the flesh or sins against one's own flesh and how those are like the worst sins. I would argue that that would be in the realm of like a sin against the flesh, more so than, sex outside of marriage, which is what people usually call that. A betrayal of one's own self is a sin in the flesh, not having sex with somebody outside of marriage, Anyways, all that to say, I'm curious to hear, in talking about A Complicated Choice, your book, it was such a important book for me in working through like all that I understood and thought about abortion and the need for being pro-choice. I read your book like while feeling very unsettled about abortion, feeling very unsettled around being pro-life or being pro-choice, and hearing all the ways that you brought in like people of like you brought in people who are Jewish and people who are Christian and people who like have all these concepts of what a life is and these concepts of what is ethical in terms of religion. And it was so helpful to me. All that to say, I'm curious to hear just like what inspired you to then write that book, and how has it been received?
I always like to share with people that this is not the book that I wanted to write or pitched to start because I was afraid to write an entire book about abortion, even though that's defined my entire professional life. I've been very vocal about it, but being someone who identifies as pro-choice and Christian, I mean, you can imagine the kind of pushback I've gotten. And so it just felt like, why not put just a bigger target on my back by writing an entire book about it? But the evolution of it was I pitched a book about reproductive loss more generally, and I wanted there to be a chapter about abortion because for many people, abortion is a reproductive loss, and defined very broadly, a loss of opportunity, a loss of social support. There's a lot of loss connected, and so I wanted to just kind of destigmatize abortion in that way, to say it's connected to all these other experiences that people have, including infertility and miscarriage and adoption and all of these things. And the publisher came back and said, that chapter on abortion, that's really the book we want you to write. And the more I thought about it, the more I agreed that there needed to be something specifically that would challenge what I see as a binary narrative on the anti-choice or pro-life side, that, abortion is the worst thing that you'll ever do and regret. And then sometimes on the pro-choice side, abortion was just a healthcare decision I needed to make. Those are stories that people have. Those are real experiences, but they don't capture what I have heard from so many people about what their actual abortion experiences were. They were much more nuanced and had a lot of emotion and grief and complicated feelings. And I wanted people to know that people who've experienced abortions to know that just because they're having difficult emotions around their abortions doesn't make it sinful or bad, or that it was the wrong decision. It just makes it deeply human. And I felt like by showing that, I could help readers who maybe were feeling ambivalent or felt politically pro-choice, but struggled more internally with the ethics of it, or just dealing with abortion stigma, which I talk about a lot, would help them sort of see the nuances more and grow their compassion muscles. I talk about like, how do we just show up for people who have experiences that we might not personally ever understand, but can still center that person in knowing that they know their own lives and stories better than any of us ever can. And we don't need to understand them fully to be that supportive presence. And to me, that's Jesus at his best, was that kind of person who journeyed with people through really, really difficult moments. And I think that is the call for us, is just to center the person impacted and say, what is it that I can do to support you during this time? So that was why I ended up writing the book, not knowing, exactly when Roe was going to be overturned. I think by the time I had sent in my final manuscript, I don't even think the Dobbs case had been lifted up yet. But I think, again, sort of spirit timing for that book to come out just a few months before the leaked Supreme Court draft felt very important because so many people were coming to me saying, like, what do? I don't understand. I'm like, I have this book to help you understand how we got here and how we're going to get out of this place.
Well, I think that's a really difficult piece of it, though, that you're touching on is there's this centerpiece of like nuance and circumstance and context that determines what someone may choose to do in a situation where they're surprised with a pregnancy or, facing, a hard choice about a pregnancy, where the majority of the conversation in the public space is in this either political or moral binary where it's either murder or it's not, it's life or it's not, it's your body, your choice, or it's someone else's body and therefore not your choice. Like these just very binary arguments about it. But the more that I hear about people's decisions regarding pregnancy and bringing a child into the world, the more it just feels obvious that you would never want to politicize that or create like such a harsh. And I think we're seeing that now in Texas and other places where all of these women are facing like real life-threatening circumstances because they don't have access to the medical care that they need because of these very strict binary lines. And the hard thing about that, though, is that when you're running a political campaign or trying to like get people to vote for you, binaries are like easy to sell and don't require a lot of critical thinking.
Yeah.
How do we adjust the conversation in the public space so that people are thinking more critically about this?
I mean, I don't think storytelling alone will solve where we are, but I think that showing the real humanity around this issue is really important because so often the conversation feels very abstract. And I think, all sides, so I won't just say both, but like all sides politically, I think are guilty of this, of focusing on like this individual abstract person who doesn't actually exist versus people who are really going through this. Partly because who wants to share their abortion story publicly? I mean, more people have done it, but it's incredibly stigmatizing, even for people who, had a non-viable pregnancy and needed care. It's very vulnerable. And also it's something that is deeply personal and private, and people shouldn't feel obligated to share.
Yeah.
But I think there's some balance that we have to have of, understanding that this never happens in a vacuum. This is always happening within a person's real life. And in addition to individual stories, there are collective injustices that are impacting people's abilities to actually make decisions. And I think that's one of the critiques of the label pro-choice is that many of the people I talked to for my book and elsewhere did not feel like they actually had a choice. They did not feel like they could actually make a decision. It was survival. It was like, this was the only thing that I could do. That doesn't make it a choice.
Totally.
That's survival. That's different. And so I talk a little bit about reproductive justice and that framework, which is really an intersectional lens that Black women created and Indigenous women created to say it's not just about legal access to abortion. It's, do I actually have the ability to create the family that I desire? Do I actually have the ability to raise my children that I have in safe and sustainable communities? And so many things have to change, not just legality, but all of the systems that we all participate in have to shift. That's a much bigger lift than being able to take a moral high ground and say, well, anyone who, has heterosexual sex, you have to be prepared to be a parent for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
How punitive is that? I mean, but that is the line that people take. Like, it's judgment versus compassion. And my book is really a call to shift out of that place of judgment. And frankly, I would say we all have judgments about people who have abortions, whether it's the number of abortions they've had or when in the pregnancy or how young or old they are or, other things like that. We feel like sometimes it's okay and other times it's not. I think the work that we have to do is, why do we feel that way? Where does that stigma come from? And realize, like, no matter what the circumstances are, none of us can put ourselves in the position of the person actually having to make that decision or live with the decision that they make.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about bringing life into the world being costly, I agree. And it will be no matter what, just because of the risks. And there's like unnecessary suffering that we could choose to alleviate if we so chose. And we opt not to. We opt not to as this culture. We make parenting so difficult. As a parent myself, we make it so difficult for people. how is that pro-life? How is, I mean, it just breaks down so quickly once you start pulling the threads. But when we stay in those very easy, binary talking points, it's easy to forget about the real people behind those talking points.
So that just makes me think of like, what would the abortion conversation look like if we lived in a world where people had access to effective birth control that didn't destroy their bodies, and we actually prosecuted sexual assault and brought down extremely high rates of rape in our culture? What would happen if we had really great access for parents? What would happen if women didn't have to give up their careers for, I mean, like, you're talking about 9 months of pregnancy followed by postpartum. Like, there's not, like, that is a hard thing to try and like maintain a very high level boss lady career during. So that's gonna hit your progress, and it's gonna change how people like. So what if we like dealt with those perceptions and got rid of stigmas? Like, if you could give birth and raise a child in a vacuum that wasn't so against your success, like, what would the conversation look like? And I think it would be so different. But I mean, and maybe this is you've already partially answered this question, but what does it look like to be pro-choice and a devout Christian? Is it possible to be pro-choice?
Or are they categorically in conflict with one another?
Completely opposed to each other.
Part of the work around this question is realizing, when did those things become equated with each other? It has not always been true. It has not always been true in the United States, and realizing that there is a political machine that has combined these two things for political power. I'm talking white Christian nationalists who made those things equate, over time so that they could control voters. And so just to say these things are not just givens. I think it feels that way just because they've done such a good job of saying that to be a religious person, by that they mean an evangelical Christian, you have to be anti-abortion, you have to be pro-life. It's worked really well to win elections over the last 50 years. So just for anyone listening, like, actually looking at why we conflate the things is important. For me, there's never been any tension between these things. I think because of where I got my start. I mean, I was in an abortion clinic holding the hands of patients, hearing their stories, seeing the holy work that was happening. I personally never really struggled with the moral question, because for me, it just felt like I'm compelled to do this. I'm compelled to be here. And what you were saying about working in a pro-life clinic, it just made me remember that, within that abortion clinic that did lots of other healthcare, if there was anyone who even wavered on their decision, they were like, you don't have to do this today. Like, you can take a little bit of time, depending where they were in their pregnancy. There really was this focus on like, this really is, there's no pressure here. We are here to help you in whatever way you need, whether that decision is to parent or to have an abortion or choose adoption later. So again, just for me, I never really felt that external conflict internally that I saw. It just never really resonated with me. And I think the other part is abortion is just not discussed in the scriptures. And I think so many people make the argument that, there are these pro-life texts, and we could talk more about what those are, but it's not mentioned. There's very little talk at all about pregnancy in the scriptures. And so it's one of those areas where we have to, take what we see thematically and apply to something that's more of a modern, I mean, it was happening at the time, but a more modern issue, and say, what are the values that we bring from the sacred text into this conversation for today? And we have to do some interpretation and work around that. And for me, accompanying someone through a reproductive decision, a crisis, that just felt so much in alignment with the stories of who Jesus was and how he interacted with people who were marginalized. I never felt a conflict about the work itself. And I think, that being said, the idea that I might need an abortion one day still caused me pause. And it was something that I was like, well, that's probably not going to be me. Well, it could have been. I'm not someone who's needed an abortion, but there have definitely been times when I'm like, I really don't want to be pregnant right now, and I really hope I'm not. I mean, that's part of that story, is realizing it's not an us versus them. I mean, there are many, many Christians who've had abortions. That's part of their stories. So I think, just starting with why do we even have this idea that you can't be pro-choice and be Christian? Where does that come from? And then what can we actually glean from our traditions that support a position where someone would wholeheartedly accompany someone through whatever reproductive decision that they need to make? And for me, there's no real conflict at all.
Yeah.
If anything, I see a lot of support for people making whatever reproductive decision is best for them.
Your experience at the abortion clinic actually makes me think of how I'm going to out myself right now that I didn't go to the gynecologist until way too late in my 20s. I didn't go to the gynecologist until I was 28, which I know is too late. I waited way too long. Everyone listening, don't do that.
Don't
go
do
to
that.
your gynecologist earlier than I did. But I just avoid doctors. So all that to say, I went to this women's clinic for my first pap smear and all this stuff. And it was genuinely just a checkup, and they do abortions. It's one of the only places in our city that does abortions. And that going to that clinic was so comforting. It was such a safe space to be in. And I was just there for a checkup essentially, but they had so much information on the walls about the reproductive system, about what you can need, where you can go if you need help, if you're in an abusive situation, if you're in need of whatever. They were very queer inclusive, and they just had all of this stuff. And even the gynecologist that saw me was very open with me and explaining everything to me. And I was like, this is the best ever. I love going to the women's clinic now, because I think it felt empowering, and it felt like I was being so supported and asked multiple times, do I need anything? Do I need any contraception? Do I need both? They just went on, and it was so nice. And so that's what I think of. I think people, especially conservative evangelicals, have this misconception around a clinic that offers abortion, and that they are, just forcing people to have abortions or something, or that they're really pushing that down people's throats. And I think that it's actually the opposite in a lot of ways. It was such a genuine, comforting experience, and I just want to put that out there.
Yeah. Well, it's actually kind of ironic. Abby Johnson, she is the center of the movie Unplanned, and she wrote a book about it. Reading her book actually made me more pro-choice than I had been previously, because even her, which her stance is now very much on the other side of the spectrum, but even she recognizes how much people on the pro-choice side of things are not trying to make more abortions happen, right?
Yeah.
That is not the agenda or the goal. The goal is supporting women through every stage of life and providing them with as many resources as they can, so that they can have at least, if it's not a lot of options, some options.
Right.
Which I that's the one thing me and my brother go back and forth about this all the time, because there are not anti-choice clinics that exist that offer nearly the breadth of healthcare that a Planned Parenthood does.
Yeah.
A pro-life clinic is not going to help you through a pregnancy. A Planned Parenthood is. They're going to give you prenatal screenings and all of the things that you need throughout, if you can't afford an OBGYN in town or whatever. But
Well, I believe you're talking about crisis pregnancy centers. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So, and I've talked about this too. I think it's important in this conversation. The main issue is that they're unregulated. Well, one, they're unregulated, and two, they receive government funding. So those two things are really challenging. And I'm very careful to say, just like with anything, there are, I'm sure, crisis pregnancy centers that do offer services that are useful to people.
Sure.
The problem is that they're not regulated. But when we're talking about family planning clinics or abortion clinics, they are heavily regulated, which they should be. If you are a healthcare provider, you should be regulated. But pro-life clinics or crisis pregnancy centers, they're not health centers. There's often nobody on staff who actually has medical training, and they pose as medical centers. And I think anything that's built on, deception or coercion you're starting from a bad place because, if people knew what they did and they're like, that's what I want. I don't want to have an abortion. I want to talk about what my options are. Like, please exist. I see a role for them. But it's when people think I'm going to be able to go here and get the medical attention, insight, referral I need and find that's not the case. That to me is really problematic. And so many of them receive money from faith-based organizations, specifically Christian ones. They are, like I said, there's, I'm sure, a spectrum, and I'm sure some of them do really good work. And like without them being regulated, we just don't know what experience people are going to have when they go in. And someone who's going because, they can't afford a pregnancy test, they're in a position of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And they need to be cared for and centered. And I'm so glad to hear that you had, who says they had a calming experience at the gynecologist? That's or comforting experience at the gynecologist. But just that they're like proactive in terms of, do you have any of these needs? Because we can help you with those. And, when I was working at, when I was volunteering, I should say, at an abortion clinic, the very first thing that they talked about post abortion was like, what kind of birth control are you interested in, right? They want to prevent unintended pregnancy so that people don't have to make these decisions unnecessarily. Of course, there are always going to be times when there's an unplanned pregnancy, and sometimes those are joyous and people want to continue them. But I think like when you talked about what would the world look like, we look around the world. We don't have to look very far to see what happens when people have access to all of those things socially. Like unintended pregnancies go down, and therefore abortions go down, because if people don't have unintended pregnancies in general, they're not going to need an elective abortion unless something goes wrong in the pregnancy.
Yeah.
We have models of what all of this could look like. And again, we just choose not to live into them. And I think that's a big moral failure of our society.
I think something that comes to mind for me as we're having this conversation is we talked about this in my training that I just finished as a somatics practitioner, and it's something called the smog effect, which is essentially like we might not all be responsible for the smog, but we're all exposed to smog, right? And we are all impacted by smog. And as we continue this conversation, I just can't stop the visualization of, I feel like we're just kind of helping try to clear away some of the smog, because these are all very emotional conversations. They tend to be, and it's rightfully so. Like, it's hard conversation. But I think when you introduce a lot of this nuance of like, this is complicated and it's okay that it's complicated, like it just kind of helps kind of clear the air almost. And so I'm just so grateful for this perspective. I think it's beautiful.
Well, I wondered if we could circle back a little bit, because you were getting into kind of the religious and faith-based aspects of abortion, how we think about it. Like, would you take us to church for a little bit, Reverend Katey, and like talk to us? Like, what does the Bible say about abortion? Like, what does the Bible say about reproductive freedom and how women should approach like motherhood and pregnancy and all of this?
As I was saying earlier, it doesn't have really anything to say about abortion specifically. The text that we do have in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, if you know it that way, there are a few where we do see a delineation of the value of that society for the pregnant person and a fetus. There's, a text that if a pregnant person is injured in battle and there's a loss of pregnancy, the perpetrator has to pay a fine. But if the pregnant person dies, it's life for life, right? So again, not super instructive for how we might want to, rule our own society. But we just see even within the text that there was an understanding that the status of a fetus and the status of a pregnant person, they're categorically different. There's a few other places like that. So we at least see, some understanding of like these things are not equated with one another. Another thing that I've learned from Jewish colleagues is they believe that life begins at first breath. I mean, from the Genesis story, that for them, that is the moment of when life begins, is first breath. So we have that. We have some texts that pro-life people like to refer to, before I knew you, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you, and point to that as a pro-life text. For me, that text is more about the soul being something that's eternal. So, what's the you before the you is formed, right? Like talking more about like that person's relationship with God is something that's eternal. It's not really about like fetal development, but
Mhm.
people point to those almost like clobber passages, like with queer
Mhm.
texts.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot there. And so when we don't have a ton of text, like what do we do? And so I just try to look at other stories where reproduction is at the forefront. One that I talk about a lot is in Exodus. The Moses story starts with midwives, standing up to the state and protecting the pregnant people and the newborn Hebrew baby boys who are going to
Yeah.
be murdered, which some might say is like a pro-life text. But for me, it's really about standing up to state-sanctioned power that's oppressive and coercive, and midwives and people who've always cared for pregnant and birthing people, like using their knowledge to protect and to stand up to power. So I see that as something that we can point to as like how we might want to show up now. And for me, the biggest text is the gospel story where there's the hemorrhaging woman who touches Jesus's garment, even though she socially wasn't allowed to be in community. She definitely wasn't allowed to touch anybody. And she catalyzes her own healing. I talk about this in the book, that she's really the one who catalyzes her own healing. She reaches out, she takes what she needs without Jesus even knowing what was happening. And he feels compelled to stop and ask what happened. Like he learns, his ministry expands because of her faith, and he affirms her whole story. I think there's communal healing that happens as she's sharing to everybody what her experience has been.
Yeah.
For me, that story really is central because it's a reproductive story, for one, because we know she had some kind of gynecological issue. Don't know what it was. But that even when she, could not get the care that she needed through what was allowed, through the doctors there, she's like, I have to do what I need to do to heal myself. And she does what she needs to, even though it's against the rules of the culture. And Jesus affirms her for that. So for me, that story really tells me everything I need to know about reproductive decision making, that like if Jesus can affirm this woman in doing what she needed to do to heal herself, then we can stand beside people as they make the decisions that they need for their own healing and wholeness, whatever that looks like.
Oh, I'm so glad I asked that question. That is such a refreshing and wise. It has the divine feminine wisdom attached to it of an interpretation of that text that has just never been offered to me, or I think most of people who are still in the fundamentalist evangelical space. The idea that reaching for your own healing is just as holy and just as affirmed by God as, waiting for the miracle or whatever,
Yeah. And how powerful she is.
Yeah.
Like her power is at the forefront.
Yeah.
Her agency, her power. I mean, Jesus has power too, but she accesses it herself. It's her intention.
Yeah.
And again, I think he is moved by what happens. And I think his ministry expands. Like it's enriched by this interaction that he has with her. And I think there are often these times when Jesus himself is expanded and grows because of his interactions with women. And this is a very powerful example of that. And again, I think the storytelling aspect of this, that she could have just gotten healed. I say this in the book. She could have just gotten healed and left the crowd, but she chooses the next brave thing, which is to say, like, it was me and here is what happened to me. And I'm going to say it not only to the person who helped heal me, but I'm going to say it to all the people who have shunned me because of this condition that I had. And I like to imagine who those characters could be in the crowd, like who would have been there. Maybe somebody else with a similar bleeding issue. Maybe some of the doctors who took advantage of her, people who shunned her. I just think there's communal healing that happens in that story that is catalyzed by her reaching out in faith for what she needed. And I just think it's so powerful. And I just love that Jesus is not the catalyst there.
Yeah.
He's
I love that.
The conduit, but not the catalyst.
I love that reframing, and like this woman was the main character in the story.
Totally, even if we don't know her name, but
she's not named, but so often in the evangelical church, women don't get to be the main character of the story by default.
Yeah.
But the truth is that was about her. And I like what you said. She took what she needed. And as women, I feel like we are so often discouraged from reaching out and taking what we require. Like we're almost shamed for having a need in the first place.
Oh, yes.
And I think that also is so pivotal, or it centers around this conversation as well. We're shamed for having a need and potentially reaching out to take it. But that story is so beautifully illustrated, as you just framed.
And as you were talking, I never even really thought about this, but maybe it's because of the somatics work you were saying, but like she makes herself small to start. She makes herself small by like, how unobtrusive can I be? So I'm unnoticed. But then she expands physically. I mean, she must have. She's like silent. She's low to the ground. But then I imagine she has to open up to speak and to be heard. And like there's an expansion that happens physically in that story too. That must have been so healing for her to like be seen and like have her voice and story. Like everyone stop and listen to this person.
Yes.
So yeah, I want to think about that some more of just even that like the inclination to make ourselves physically small and then to take up space is present in that story too. And I never even thought about it till just now. So thank you for it. That's what I love about sacred text is like there's always something deeper. There's like another level in conversation. That's why I just refuse to give up these texts because there's a lot of problematic sacred texts. But then there are these amazing ones that have so much to offer us as we talk about them. And I just refuse to abdicate those to people who are opposed to what I do.
Yeah.
Like, you don't get to take those stories. They're mine too.
Yeah.
They're mine too. They're ours too.
Yeah. And I actually love that you bring this up actually, because to me, there's the same beauty in that communal experience of sharing of story, sharing of struggle. Even Emma, what you were sharing about the clinic, like people caring for each other, like, and it makes me think of, I've been on like a witch history kick, and listener, if you haven't been, witch history is feminist history. It's very important. But there's this cute little booklet called Witches, Nurses, and Midwives. And essentially it's breaking apart this concept of witches, because really what happened back in the day with all the witch hunts is midwives and nurses were persecuted as witches. And so as we're unpacking this conversation, I can't help but really bring that to mind. Like there's been this like onslaught of patriarchy against that innate feminine wisdom, that innate feminine care, whether you identify as, femme or not. Like there's that tenderness, right? That is typically associated with femininity, but whatever. I don't want to get too binary, but it's 100% binary what I'm saying right now. But anyway, and so I just find it really, really like as a through thread in this conversation. But as we're talking about misconceptions around witches, midwives, etc., I'm really curious, Katey, what misconceptions about being pro-choice are you hearing, but specifically within the evangelical space? I can think of a few, but I can't wait to hear your take.
Yeah,
Go off.
Who are the modern day witches?
Yeah, who's the modern witch hunters? Tell us about that.
What comes to mind first is more the narrative of like who people are who are having abortions to begin with. And I think there's a misconception that there's this group of, irresponsible young people who are just having sex with whoever and, aren't being responsible and, need to have an abortion just because they couldn't be bothered to use birth control method. Now, does that happen? Sure. But, statistically, we're talking majority of people who have abortions are already parents. And I think it's really important to talk about how having an abortion is often a parenting decision. And that shows up in my book in lots of stories where people say, I already have, I've completed my family, or I have a 2-year-old, or, I would not be able to provide for another child in the way that I want to, not just financially, but just bandwidth wise.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big one for people just when we're talking about this, that to know that a majority of people who have abortions are already parents is a really big one. I think in terms of people who hold pro-choice views, there's like we're callous, that we don't have any regard for the value of pregnancy or fetal life, that we're godless, that we're out to like destroy the family structure, which in some ways I think we are in terms of like
Kinda.
patriarchy. But or that we feel like, that we're denigrating parenting or motherhood. I think those are some of the misconceptions that I see, like a callousness and a disregard and a lack of morality around this. And again, not seeing pregnancy as having any sort of value. And to be fair, I think sometimes folks who identify as pro-choice, we don't always do a good job of showing our nuance. And I think that's because there's a fear that if we show any regard at all, that will be kind of betraying our cause. And I think that's why it was important for me to write the book that I did, to give, advocates permission to own their own stories of pregnancy and abortion, but also that we can still hold to the values that like the law should not decide what people's medical care is, and also allow space for hard conversations about, making a reproductive decision, that it can be very nuanced. And what we don't want is for people to feel isolated and like they have nobody while they're going through it. And that's the part that I see so much, is like the isolation. And like, to the credit of the pro-life movement, I think they've done a good job of creating community for people who've gone through abortions. In the sense that they'll talk about it and there's a place for people to go and there are resources, and it's also coercive. But I think that that's something that we haven't done well. So in some ways, as I'm talking, I'm like, I see why those stereotypes are there. Like I can sort of see the callousness, the perception of callousness. I know it's not true because I know the people who do this work. And I just think sometimes we haven't done a good job of kind of showing our tenderness and compassion for fear of that being turned and used against us.
Yeah, I think about, I mean, I know we joke about, like, actually, we kind of do want to destroy the family framework because there are these patriarchal norms. But what I hear so many people who are pro-choice actually talk about is sort of reforming the family framework, right? Like, we're not anti having children or having a family or having community. We're pro people feeling respect and dignity, pro people having the opportunity to build a family in the way that's going to be the most fruitful for them, and the way that's going to allow them to flourish, that's going to be fulfilling, that's going to be the best for the child. Like, there's so many factors. And when I think about like the people who are getting abortions and the people who are needing access to abortive care, like, those are often people who do not have the privilege of contraception always, or the privilege of feeling safe in their relationships, or the privilege of financial security. And it's like, it makes me really upset because you think about like the crisis pregnancy centers or just any pro-life groups are actually manipulating people who are at their most vulnerable points. Right. And how is that not callous? Like, how is that not cold-hearted? It's getting me emotional to think about it all. But like that, the people, like, there's the statistic that recently came out. Correct me if I'm quoting it incorrectly, but that 65,000 pregnancies have occurred from like sexual assault or rape since Dobbs being passed in anti-choice states. So that's not even in pro-choice states. That's in anti-choice states. 65,000 like non-consensual pregnancies have occurred. And to say like, oh, actually, like, you don't get access to that care because we've decided that you don't get ownership over your body. And even though you're vulnerable, even though you were violated, even though all these things have had to trickle to bring you to this point of needing abortion care, of being ripped from the privilege of getting to determine when you get pregnant or to determine whether or not you get pregnant. Like, that's the most callous thing in the world to me.
The violations that are both individual and then collective or imposed state-sanctioned violation of your bodily autonomy. We're talking about people who have already experienced a total like disregard for their bodily autonomy and dignity, and doing what they need to do, trying to reach out, right? Like with the hemorrhaging woman, to say, this is something that I have to do for myself. I have to like figure out how I'm going to survive, how I'm going to move forward. And then to be denied that care for ideological reasons that have nothing to do with that person. It's beyond callous. I think it's cruel. I think what we do to pregnant people in this country is cruel and inhumane. And not just sexual assault, but I heard a story recently of a friend who's done a film on people who have abortions later in pregnancy. And this woman was miscarrying and the hospital wouldn't intervene. They actually tried to weigh like the maxi pad she brought soaked full of blood to justify like if there was enough blood loss to intervene. Like we are letting people get to the brink of death before providing them with medical care. And how is that pro-life? And also what are the long-term impacts, like emotionally, physically, and letting people get to the brink of death before we intervene and save their lives? I just think we won't know the impacts of what this is for a long time. But I think just knowing that that's happened to even one person, it should have all of us enraged and emotional because it's so cruel and inhumane and unnecessary. You know, we talk about like there's always going to be suffering, but why do we allow and actually create unnecessary suffering when there's so much suffering that we can't do much about? But we actually could like stop this, and we are creating unnecessary suffering for so many people and families.
And I think too, on that topic of that 65,000 pregnancies since the Dobbs decision, it's estimated that that's only 5%. That's the result of 5% of sexual assault. And it's like, what are we doing to protect these people from being assaulted? And like zooming out further, what's going to happen to those 65,000 pregnancies? Like like, how are we supporting people? I think that's probably my most, I mean, it's all enraging, but I think that is something that makes me even more enraged is like, you're saying, no, we won't allow you to get what you need and support you. And on the other end, like what Kelly mentioned earlier, there's such a lack of support for new mothers and like trying to navigate this whole complicated system. And I don't know. I just see such a lack of resources. You're saying you can't have this resource, but we're not going to resource you in other ways. Like just deal with the hand that you've been dealt.
It should be the no choice movement.
No choices.
No choice.
Well, like, are you really valuing the lives of newborns and either, right? Because if you're impacting a parent's well-being, it all breaks down so quickly. It's like, what do you think actually is required to sustain the life of a newborn? And Kelly, this is very imminent for you, but like I can remember too, just like my own suffering. I didn't have maternity leave. I didn't have maternity leave and I was like working in maternal health. So the mental gymnastics was wild, but just feeling like, wow, my body's not valued and my body right now is sustaining the body of another person. And there's no support for me, or even just like trying to bring breast milk through an airport and being questioned as to why I had it. You know, I mean, it's just,
oh my God.
It's just wild how like we punish people for procreating.
Well, and I think what you're talking about is like the majority, or at least the largest group of people who get abortions are already parents. Makes so much sense to me. And it's shocking that we do not give people who have been through the experience and have the most authority to speak into the cost of pregnancy, childbirth, and the rearing of a child, like of anyone who should be speaking into how these decisions are made. It should be these parents that know exactly what they're getting into, who should have the loudest voice. But I think when we hear about abortion, like you said, we're hearing about sexual assault. We're hearing about a 12-year-old who is being forced into all terrible things, you know,
hearing, like the extreme stories.
Yes. Yeah. But we're not hearing about mother of two who just wanted to make a decision for her family because she knows what it takes to knit a child in her own womb for 9 months.
Mhm.
And the physical toll that takes, the mental toll, the effect on her family and her career, just to build the human.
Just to build the human.
Yeah, just the building process is one thing. And then after that, like healing from childbirth, going through childbirth, the risks associated, and then literally sustaining that human with one's own body. It's a huge, immensely complicated and immensely burdensome thing to choose to do. And I think it's incredibly beautiful. And it's like miraculous and holy and sacred, all in its own right. But it does not come free or cheap to that person. Why are we not pulling more parents into this conversation who have had abortions and who can talk about it? Because I don't know, maybe it just seems too elective. Like they didn't have enough of a reason not to.
Yeah. I just think, for most people at different points of their, in heterosexual relationships or not even just that, but like at different times, you're going to need to access contraception. You're going to need to access prenatal care. You're going to need to access abortion care. Like most people have to have a need for most, if not all of those things at different points because our reproductive lives are so long.
Yeah.
They start when we're young people, like teenagers,
even
even earlier now, all the way through, 40s, right? That's 30 years plus of needing to either avoid having a pregnancy or planning a pregnancy or caring for yourself postpartum. Most people, like I said, they're going to need to access all of these services. And so the fact that we take abortion care and we pull it away from the full spectrum of our reproductive lives is so stigmatizing when like you should be able to get the same care no matter what stage you're in, whether it's I need birth control, I need prenatal care, I need postpartum care, I need an abortion. They should all be available. But even like nurses training and gynecologists and OBGYNs trainings, like they're not required to even learn how to provide abortion care. I mean, it's just wild how it's gotten so politicized and stigmatized that it's almost as if it's like the separate thing that happens out here and it's not like part of just what it means to be embodied.
I love that you're pulling on that thread too, because like within the medical system, I was chatting with my sister who's a new nurse, and she said miscarriages are also like it's an abortion. Like it's a spontaneous abortion. And then we use words like a D&C versus abortion.
Right.
I'm like, literally abortion means a removal of the fetus from the uterus. And that's all it means. And yet it's become so politicized. And it's like, I don't understand how and why we got here.
I just like can't help but think if the powerful men who inform most of the decisions about how our healthcare decisions are made had to like experience body altering, life-changing pregnancies and then sustain those lives from their own bodies, also body altering and life-changing, this would not even be a conversation.
No.
Because it is not. Like, I think I was so gaslit my whole life as to what pregnancy and parenthood means that, like, it's been such a beautiful and revelatory process in becoming a parent as I have, like, discovered what so many women go through and no one acknowledges it. It's like we give more credit to people who run a marathon. We're like, wow, that's so impressive. I'm like, we should be like
hailed.
That's right. Yeah. I remember post-birth, I was just like, I feel like a warrior goddess. I mean, I was like, that is the most powerful I've ever felt. I know it's not that way for everybody, but just kind of speaking to the feat of it, of enduring it. And like, sure, you know, our bodies are designed in a way to do it, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. It's very difficult. And I remember thinking like, I don't think I really have to prove myself anymore. I did that. But you're right that we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about all of the ways that pregnancy impacts bodies, like during pregnancy, post-pregnancy. Your body is not the same. It is different. And some things are really challenging, and some people have really like long-lasting, lifelong issues post-pregnancy. We don't talk about like the costs that are not just imminent in the real moment, but what are the costs of having been like your postpartum the rest of your life? And then also, what does it mean to parent someone for the rest of your life? I mean, parenting is not something that stops. Once your kid is here, it's like a little part of your heart running around the world. And it's probably the only, in my experience, it's been the only thing that's like the longest lasting commitment I've made is agreeing to parent somebody.
Yeah.
It just doesn't ever stop. And so how are we thinking like beyond just even like the early days or even elementary school, high school, middle school? Like it is a huge, huge commitment to make. It's the most sacred decision I think that we can make. And it shouldn't be left to chance. And I think that that's why the decision to end a pregnancy can be such a good parenting decision, even if you're not a parent. But like, I do not have what I need to do this the way that I would want to. And I'm not going to do it right now. And I'm going to potentially wait until the time that I can really do this. I think that's what a lot of people say. Like, I want to be a parent, just I can't be a parent right now.
Yeah.
That's wise. We should applaud people for doing that.
Yeah.
For knowing themselves well enough to know what is wise for them in the moment, even if it's difficult, even if it causes grief, even if people don't understand. Like we should be applauding and supporting people in doing that hard thing, not making it impossible for them to just get the care they need.
As we're talking about all of the actual tender care and decision making that goes into having an abortion, that goes into deciding how to formulate your family and everything that falls under that, the rhetoric that I hear so often from the evangelical side is, well, all of that really doesn't matter because abortion is murder. Full stop. And that is like the like argument ender that you kind of get. It's like, well, it's murder, so sorry. Like,
you can't murder someone just because it's hard.
Yeah, you can't. Exactly. And that is rhetoric that I've ascribed to in the past. Like, that is like the way that so many people are thinking about abortion and what it is. So I'm curious, especially for, for anyone who's like Kelly, who has a brother that she's debated about some of this stuff with, or like who is like, I get all of these things, but like, how do I speak to somebody, or what can my response even be to, well, it's murder, so.
I mean, it's very incendiary language that is designed to shut down dialogue. And I think there are times when there are just some folks who probably might not be worth your time to try to talk to about this. If that's their line and there's no room for asking questions or kind of digging into more of what that means or where it comes from. I generally don't debate people on this issue. And I get that for some people that's like within your family or within your faith community, and you don't want to just not engage with them because they're probably people you care about, so I always try again, like, how do you reconnect it to the humanity? Because we all have reproductive stories, because saying abortion is murder, again, is just getting into the abstract. It's like not thinking about the real people who are connected to it. So, trying to ask more questions about like just people's reproductive journeys or their lives, or like what stories from your family do you know? Because like all these people now are finding out they had relatives they didn't know about because of all of the 23andMe and stuff, right? Like there's all these secrets in our families that are connected to our reproductive lives. I think if we can start that helps people get into the complexity. I think it's just like, how do you disrupt, not let yourself get pulled into the anger and the emotion of the incendiary comment, but like bring a curiosity to the conversation and compassion, especially if you have come from a community like that, what how binary thinking is taught to you. And I try to remember that too. Like I used to subscribe to some pretty binary thoughts about a lot of things. And there were patient people who asked me some really important questions who over time helped me open my mind. So I feel like if the point of engaging with someone like that is to dig your own heels in so that you feel like righteous in your views, it's probably going to be a waste of your breath. But if the idea is to, how can I ask a question and bring a curiosity that might leave that person asking some questions about this viewpoint they just stated, that abortion is murder. I don't know what that would be. It's probably going to be different for every person. Maybe it's asking about like, well, maybe it's talking about a specific example of something you've heard in the news. Like this woman had a non-viable pregnancy and she needed an abortion to save her life and she was denied one. Like, is that not murder?
Yeah.
Or I don't know if you'd use that language, but I'm just thinking like, because probably that person's going to be like, well, in that case, right? So you create a little opening of, it's actually maybe not as simplistic as just saying abortion is murder, full stop. Like, I think most people have nuanced views about this, even if they don't say it, because they don't know how to articulate it. But on most issues, we all have moral wrestling. Like we're not one or the other. And I think most people would actually probably identify as pro-life and pro-choice together. Like I value life and I value decision-making.
Yeah.
I just think if there's any sort of opening that you can get by bringing it back to the humanity, to the individual, to the person suffering because of these laws, I think that might be a way in, rather than trying to just disprove why abortion is not murder, which you could. You could say, well, you know, what about all of these frozen embryos that are in fertility clinics that get destroyed? Like, that would be mass murder, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps at all because it keeps it in the realm of the like the intellectual.
Sure.
When really
you're
this
like
is like a hard
entertaining their logic. In
exactly.
A sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think for like white people, especially, getting into the heart space and out of their heads is really important. And I think that's why the storytelling aspect is so important, because it gets us out of just like this heady place where I don't actually have to think about any other human beings. I can think about these like ideas of these cute little babies in my mind versus like the person who is at the hospital being denied an abortion because of the state law, but they're on their deathbed.
Yeah.
Our tolerance of people's suffering is so high, of other people's suffering is so high. And why is that?
Why do we turn a blind eye to that? And I like that you brought that up, like, of like, it's really important for us to get out of our heads and into our hearts, because this is a very embodied issue. Once I think you can experience that through story, that medium that you utilize so well, you can start to really connect in that embodied way to it. But like you said, like finding that crack almost that you described all the way at the beginning of our episode. Where's the crack? Because that's your way in.
Well, it's almost like, you know, the ethical dilemma of you're on a train and it's going to split in two ways. And if you pick the right side, you're going to kill your friend. And if you pick the left side, you're going to kill 5 people or whatever. And which one do you pick or whatever? The question is meant to trigger how you value life and like a deeper conversation of context, etc. If we were to sit and debate each other on which side we should go on, like right or left, that is where you're not really making any progress, right?
Yeah.
Because the purpose of that thought experiment is not which is the correct answer and let's debate each other. It is, what are the types of things on how we see life and the value of life leading us to make the decision that we're making? And when we're making ethical decisions like this, how do we pull back from the immediate circumstance and think about the nuance and the context and the different things that might inform someone's decision? And so it's almost like debating about abortion is like debating over the correct answer of this thought experiment instead of stepping back and being like, okay, this is the potential 2 outcomes, but like the why and how are actually where we're going to connect as humans.
And you're never going to actually be in that situation.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Like it's totally abstract. And I think one area that where I've grown is I've just thought about the things that I told myself, like, I would never do X, Y, Z. And then I've inevitably done them. You know, I think it's true about abortion. Like you do not know what decision you would make until you have to make the decision. And I've heard that from so many people where they're like, I didn't think this is something I was ever going to need until I needed it. And it's the same with like pro-life people get abortions too, because they get pregnant and they need one and they get them. Like, I mean, it's as simple as that. Like you really honestly do not know what you would do until you're in that situation. And I think that's where the compassion has to come to the forefront of just realizing like, that's an experience I might be able to understand one day, I might not, but I have to trust that that person is the one who can make the decision because for them, it is their real life.
Yeah.
You know, it's not abstract.
How do you feel / do you feel that white saviorism plays a huge role in this conversation as well? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I feel like where I see that the most, and you all might have another take on it, but I remember being at the opening of an abortion clinic in Maryland with some colleagues, including some Black women, and the protesters there of the clinic were saying, like, this is a Black genocide, that abortion is Black genocide, and like, we're here to save Black babies, basically, these white people. And I looked around at them and I said, you don't have any Black people here protesting this clinic. They're not here.
Yeah.
Please don't talk to me about how you value Black lives and you make it all about abortion. We don't look at like the history of reproductive injustice on Black folks from the beginning, since they were, kidnapped and brought here.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of that. Like, it's an easy way for white people to feel like they're being anti-racist, and they use like the language of, like the 1960s civil rights movement to be anti-abortion, or women's voting right, like suffragettes. They use that language rather than having to deal with like, what is the actual suffering for communities of color in this country?
Exactly.
It's not about like needing abortion care. It's like everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
that's where I see it mostly, but maybe you meant it in a different way.
No, that's 100% kind of what I was getting at. Cause I'm like, great. How are you resourcing those communities of color?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing to help ease their systemic injustice and like trauma?
Yeah.
Like, how are you, what are you voting on for your tax dollars to help these poor Black moms out? Like, what are you doing? Like, how are you trying to get people out of jail that have been put in jail because they're of color and they don't really have a real crime associated with them, right? Like, how are you impacting the system to make it better so that women of color are not forced to make this choice?
Right. Or Black women dying in childbirth 3 times the rate of white women.
Exactly.
No matter what their social or economic classes or education, they're dying 3 times as often. Like, that, you could start right there.
Exactly.
Make it safe for Black women to give birth.
That is a great thing to start poking at as a society. Like, what the fuck? What's happening over here?
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think so much of white saviorism centers on like moral superiority and moral supremacy. And so I think that, like, of course, plays a role. Is that we have,
we know best.
Yeah, these people with this idea that I have an intellectual understanding of or perception that is superior to what even Black people have.
Yeah.
Because they're not here protesting, so I'm here on their behalf because I know it's best for them.
The audacity to assume that you know enough about the Black American experience that you can go advocate on their behalf.
And I'm going to continue to like disagree with them on gun rights and police brutality and inequality in schools and the medical system, etc., because they just don't know the nuance of that. But I'm here because I care about babies.
Yeah. And that's not to say, like, I do think that, like, we as dominant culture should definitely be partnering with communities of color, but on the issues that they are advocating and speaking out about, not this one where no one of color is present. Like, what are you talking about?
I love, Katey, that you pointed that out, that, like, you're there with colleagues who are Black, who are participating in opening this clinic, and there are all white protesters claiming that you're there to kill Black babies. Like, it's this cognitive dissonance that ties into what you're saying, Kelly, of thinking, oh, well, we know what's best for you. You don't actually know. And choosing to not listen to what the marginalized group is actually asking for help on, is actually crying out about, is actually like trying to advocate and get you to partner with them on. Instead, you're like, no, actually, I'm going to focus on this thing over here. And like, I don't really care that once you do have a kid that they can't get a good education. Like, I don't care that they're going to have such a high risk of being shot in the streets. Like, I don't care. But I care that they're born.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think that brings us all to a point about, like, we actually are facing real tangible threats to reproductive access and reproductive rights in our country, especially in red states, but it's just kind of scary in general across the United States how that's going to go. And you have been looking at this issue for a long time and probably observing. I know in our pre-interview you mentioned you weren't eventually surprised by the Dobbs decision.
Right.
But like what scares you about the present future of access to abortion care or just reproductive care in general, but like also what gives you some hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's most frightening is knowing that the white Christian nationalist agenda doesn't stop here. That their agenda includes, a constitutional amendment that would codify anti-abortion laws into the Constitution, and that would include forms of contraception also. And so I think just realizing that this isn't the end, that there's going to be a continuation at the federal level, for this to become codified into the law, where states would then be compelled to follow that, right? Because right now it's up to the states individually, which is both really difficult and negative for the folks living in states with legislatures that are passing abortion bans left and right. But then for the states that are codifying, abortion access into their state constitutions, that's where we see some of the hope. And we also see when voters are asked to weigh in on this, being anti-abortion is not popular. I mean,
No.
ballot measures have been failing, which gives me hope, but it's also infuriating because we already knew before the overturn of Roe that was not the majority of voters did not support making abortion illegal, regardless of their moral stance. This was not popular. But people have managed to get themselves elected who then represent this white Christian nationalist agenda where, like, regardless of what the population wants, they are going to push through their agenda. And so I think it's like the both and, where we see the power of the people when they show up to vote, or legislatures who are being proactive and governors and things like that. But then we've got like this other thing in motion that's working at the federal level that's really frightening and frustrating. So it's both and. And I think in addition to laws, I trust that, like the midwives in Exodus, that people are making sure that their communities are cared for regardless of what the law says. And I know that that's true, and there are probably elements of it that I don't even know about, but I have to remember that there are realities that exist beyond our political system, outside of the political system, where communities are caring for each other and making sure that people get what they need regardless. But again, like the thing that's scariest to me is just knowing that like this political movement will not stop. It will continue. It will become more extreme and impact more and more of us, which means that it's also a way for us to unite together because all of our bodily autonomy is being threatened. It's not just people who can get pregnant. And that gives me some hope too. So I don't know, maybe things have to be really scary in order for there to be hope that rises up of like how we can band together. It certainly felt that way over the overturn, which we've been waiting for that moment for probably like 10 years or so, knew it was coming. And have been preparing for it. And at the same time, nothing can prepare you for the loss of something that big. So, but the opportunity I think is that people are paying attention in ways that they weren't before and are willing to speak up and are willing to maybe challenge some of their beliefs now. And I see that as, part of the role that I can play is just helping people figure out kind of what we do from here.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of comfort in feeling like, oh, well, we have Roe versus Wade, so
exactly.
There's nothing that we really need to do. There wasn't like as much, I think, like impulse to like rally around this, like the access to abortion care. And now with the overturning of Dobbs, it's sort of like the loss of something that you kind of like took for granted having in the first place. And realizing like, oh, we need to like really fight for this, and we need to advocate and step up to like secure this right. We've seen that, I think, like really corral people into action, which is great.
And I think people are learning that, we talk about Roe v. Wade was the floor and not the ceiling. It was like bare minimum and really didn't offer the protections that we all think it did. And it got chipped away over time and redefined by the Supreme Court over time. And for many people, access to abortion care was impossible already where they lived. States with one provider or no provider. There were like abortion deserts everywhere. It's just now on a scale that we haven't seen before, but it's always been true. And that trend was happening at the state level for years and years before the overturn. It's just now it's way more extreme. So people are paying attention in a way that they weren't before. And I think it's just important to know that like there's never been a time when abortion access has been available to everybody who needed it.
Yeah.
So when we think about what we need, we want something way better than Roe.
Yeah.
We want
Totally.
something like in that reproductive justice vein of like making sure that everyone has like access to healthcare, but also all the other things that they need to thrive and to flourish with their families. It's way
Yeah.
more than just legal abortion. You got to have access to it.
Mhm.
You know, those
Yeah.
things are different too. Legality and accessibility are not the same.
That's
Legal,
really
good.
regulated.
Everyone
Yeah.
simmer on that.
That's a quote
Legality and
right there.
accessibility are not the same thing.
Yep.
Love it.
Oh, that's so good. I love that we're kind of ending on this rallying cry of hope. And I also love what you said about the Roe was the floor, not the ceiling. And what we really need is better care all around. And like you mentioned, abortion deserts. There should not be an abortion desert. People should have access, must have access to the care that they need. So that feels like just a beautiful rallying cry to me. So feminists unite everywhere. And I guess before we lead into our final question, I'm actually curious how you would recommend people start getting involved, because this affects everyone.
The first thing I always recommend people do is just start with their own story and beliefs around this and just interrogating where they come from. You know, I've mentioned a few times abortion stigma. I think it's something that we all have because we've all been around the rhetoric of white Christian nationalism that abortion is wrong.
Yeah.
Just starting even with your own self of like, what do I believe about this? What elements of this make me uncomfortable? What would I support someone at this stage of a pregnancy getting an abortion? Just getting crystal clear about what your own values are and maybe even challenging them a little bit before you do anything else. And then I think if you're someone who's interested in the activism side, I always recommend folks look for, you know, their local abortion fund. There's one in at least one in every state. That those are the folks who are actually raising the money to get people where they need to for care. And they are the experts, and they've been doing this work before the overturn of Roe. And so I always recommend people, if you're looking for somewhere to support, I always say, find your abortion fund. You can go to the National Network of Abortion Funds, nnaf.org, and look up which ones serve your community or neighboring states and get involved there. And then I think another place, we've talked a lot about stories. There are some amazing storytelling websites. Be careful when you're looking for abortion stories where you go, but one that might be a good resource for your listeners is Shout Your Abortion. And these are just people like talking about their abortion experiences, and they're not, they're very human and complicated. And just start, if you haven't talked to somebody about their abortion experiences or don't have one yourself, I think just starting to listen to what people have been through can be a really great starting point. So I would say, you know, those three things are, you know, definitely do the first one. And then maybe the stories. And then if you're looking to do more, supporting your local abortion fund is a great way to get started. And of course, if you're a spiritual person and you're wondering about the spiritual questions, we'd love for you to visit our website, the rcrc.org, Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And we also have a companion site called Abortion's Welcome. That's for people before, during, and after abortion, as a pro-choice spiritual companion site. So those are some ways, if you're interested in these specific kinds of questions, you might get more information that you're looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those. And I always hate like winding down from an interview because vibes are good, you know?
Yeah.
As our closing question, we always like to ask our guests, completely open to your own interpretation, but what does woman being mean to you?
For me, it almost stands not against, but in conversation with this idea of woman doing, because for me, I feel like woman doing has defined so much of my life. It's about my performance and what I'm contributing to the world and what I'm generating and what I'm writing. And that has so much defined my being a woman for so long. And now I turned 40 last year, and I am like woman being, like I am in my own power, and that I have worth and value just in my very being. And so I think woman being for me is about just resting in that truth that has always been true, but has taken me 40 years to realize, which is just being itself is sacred and valuable and worthy.
Yeah.
So that's what it means to
love
me.
That. I love it. And also, congrats on being 40. I love it.
I highly recommend it.
Honestly, I can't wait. The three of us actually all turned 30 this year. And I'm like,
Amazing.
let's get it.
Yes, very excited.
So excited.
Amazing. Well, I honor that too, because going from 20s to 30 is a big one. You know, I think each decade brings new self-awareness and changes. And I look forward to hearing how your 30s go. They were very transformative for me, and I'm sure will be for you too. But yeah, 40 is feeling good so far.
Amazing. And then, Katey, any further resources you would like to recommend? Plug away any of your own websites. I know you mentioned your coalition and a couple other items, but and also like anything that you would just recommend to listeners. That could be a documentary, it could be a book, your own book, where people could buy your book, websites, etc. Just any resources that you think people should consider. It could also even just be what's on your nightstand right now.
All right. So in terms of further reading, so yes, I did write a book called A Complicated Choice. If you're looking for storytelling and kind of a guide and how to deal with your own abortion stigma, it's great for groups. Another book, if you're looking into the ethics around this and you identify as Christian or Christian adjacent, one that I would recommend my colleague wrote is called Trust Women by Rebecca Todd Peters. It's a little more academic. It's a lot more academic than mine, but it gets more into the minutia of these things. So if you're someone who's like really wanting to get into the ethical questions, that's a great book to look at. I would love for you all to connect with me. I love being in conversation with people. And I know sometimes podcasts like this can bring up issues for you. Like me, I'm sure there are people listening who've had abortions, maybe haven't shared their story. So I'm always like, my DMs are always open to have conversations with people who want to share. Yeah. So you can find me on all the socials at Katey Zeh. And I mentioned RCRC and Our Abortion's Welcome. And I'm trying to think, honestly, right now, I'm not reading or consuming anything related to this work because that's how I stay grounded, is like totally just in my life. I've had to give myself permission around that too. And I think for activists, maybe this is more of just like a life tip, but remembering that this work that we do to transform the world ought to be life-giving and joy-filled for us. And I actually think living a life of joy and enjoyment is part of the resistance to the oppression that we experience. Yes. And so I would just, I guess as a recommendation, like if you are someone who is doing the work, like trying to change the world, just make sure that you remember that you're part of that world that you want to change, and that your life and the way that you get to live your life ought to be full of the values that you're trying to bring into the world at large. So just do what you can to like make your life more beautiful and joy filled. And then that will sustain you in the work long term, because this is going to take a long time for us to get where we want to go. So we've got to enjoy it. We have to enjoy the ride as we go through it.
Yes.
Oh, and this is just reminding me that you're like a CEO of a nonprofit and you have so much wisdom.
Yes.
I'm like how to cry hearing you talk about this. Oh, it's so good. We can do a whole nother podcast, but anyways, that's so good.
No, I love it. Being embodied in the work, right? That is where we're able to be most present and most powerful.
And doesn't like, I think of this like as I go after filmmaking, right? Like me having enjoyment outside of the specific subject of film enriches my filmmaking.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so like reading books that like you enjoy, or, you know, doing things that give you joy actually enrich the work that you do for the better.
Yeah. If you were a filmmaker who only consumed things about filmmaking, you'll wind up being one of those people that just makes movies about making movies, which those movies are often bad. So cliche. It's like, it's you get too inside that world. And I think that happens with anything. If you're too inside the world of what your passion is or what you're advocating for or whatever it is, then you lose perspective of all the fullness of everything that's out there. So it's grounding.
I mean, I say yes and amen, ladies.
Yeah.
What a good conversation, you guys. I mean, thank you both for being here. And Katey, thank you for being here. You are just a delight and a wonder to behold. And I'm so glad that we got to spend, some more time with you. Yeah. So, women beings, make sure to give us a review if you enjoyed this episode, which I know you did. Please. 5 stars, unless you think it's 4, but probably 4.5 if you have to go 4. And make sure you're following us on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, because we're everywhere.
Yeah.
You can always reach out to us. We are open to conversation as well. And make sure you're following Katey because, again, just a delight and a wonder.
Yeah.
So, all that being said, we will catch you next time.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.